And here we are. Well, so this is a whole bunch of us who did this work on the benefits of partnerships for threatened species conservation. It actually arose, it was a direct response to a request from the department that we run a project like this within the TSR Hub. And Simon Nally came in as a co-leader. I don't know whether Simon's online now, but anyway. And then a group of us did the work from across the country. And the reason for this study is that it's often assumed that partnerships improve the effectiveness of threatened species conservation, but there's lots of different sorts, reasons, and there are costs involved in partnering, as well as a whole range of potential benefits. But there's very little research on what works best with partnerships. So what we did was we used social science methodologies and did lots of interviews across the country and looked at, we had 44 interviews, but only 24 partnerships because we wanted to do some triangulation. We focused on a range of species. There you can see on the right there are different levels of threats, different parts of the country, different types of animal. We weren't able to look at indigenous partnerships. We were simply defeated by COVID. It was better to do nothing than do something badly. So we had to give up on that. So we identified 14 ingredients for creating functional partnerships. And they fell into two groups. There were recommendations for creating cohesion, stability, and motivation, and for achieving recovery success. And don't read those because I'm going to go through them individually now. And first, the top of the list is finding a champion, leader, coordinator, someone who'll bring it all together, bring a partnership together. And it was quite interesting when we looked across all the different projects we visited. Many of them come from, they're individuals. I've just finished revising an action plan for birds, and I've done this since 1990. It's amazing how many people I was talking to this time that I talked to 30 years ago about threatened species recovery, about the same threatened species. People have given their lives, their careers to looking after particular species and ensuring they persist. Sometimes they're within government, sometimes not. Sometimes it's an organization that will be the champion. More often it's as the individual. When you start, make sure there's time put into establishing and maintaining relationships. The champions are very well, but they can't do it on their own. And all partners have a role in working together. Communicating, networking, staying in touch, and finding out about problems before they actually become problems. I'm going to show you a few of the pictures. These come from an earlier study on recovering Australian threatened species, co-edited by one of the department's own, Peter Latch, and thoroughly recommend it. And a lot of the recommendations coming out of this study you can see emerging from these success stories. So the next one is establish clear objectives, understand each other's expectations. Often you get partners coming together, they all want to save a species, but they have different ideas on how to go about it. So you need to make that clear from the start on what the roles are. And what expectations of other people's roles as well. Set up an appropriate governance structure. Now this depends on the project scale. You don't want something really complicated for a local project, something that's only going to go on for a short time. It needs a governance structure, but one that is tailored to the size of the project. Long-term projects, complex projects, you may need MOUs and documents that set out how the objectives are going to be achieved. And you've got to listen to everybody who's a stakeholder in a particular species in developing that governance structure. Really important to acknowledge the contributions of everybody. There will be some who will contribute more than others, but it will depend on capacity, what they bring to a partnership, but even people playing a very small role need appreciation, need some sort of reward to keep going. And recognize the important contributors, but also the little ones. And celebrate when you can. Plan for risks. Have a bit of redundancy in the system. You can get changeover in partners, changeover in coordinators. Prepare for that. It's got to happen sometime. So make sure that's there from the start. Funding arrangements usually evolve over time. So be prepared for that. Make sure people understand each other's roles and pass on the information, and have contingency plans for sudden changes. That seems to make a difference in partnership success. And communicate. How often do you see plans being reviewed and it's all about communication? If there's a problem, it's about communication. But it's a good idea to tailor it. Don't overwhelm people with too much information, but don't provide too little. Don't condescend either. So be as transparent as possible. People will often understand more than one might anticipate. It's a matter of communicating about how to communicate, and monitor satisfaction with communication, so that if there are gaps in communication, know about it early. So then there's a set of achieving recovery success, and often a partnership requires a mix of skill sets. That photo's off to collect phasmids near Lord Howe Island. Not everybody will have those skills, but you need those skills in a team to achieve success in something like that. Also, sharing knowledge about skills means you can learn from mistakes and make more informed decisions. So you need to match the partner skills to the recovery needs for the species. Not every threatened species needs rock climbing abilities. Establish clear recovery objectives and understand each partner's expectations. A bit similar to the point 2 above. Revisit the objectives as required. Document expectations and review satisfaction with the process. Partnerships are never static. They're always dynamic, and you need to make sure that you maintain them by working on them, as happens with any relationship. Create strategic plans to guide recovery actions. A bit of debate recently about recovery plans and conservation advice. In a sense, it doesn't matter whether there's a legal document or not, or what that document is. You still need some sort of planning, and it needs to set targets and assess performance. They should be written collectively, bring the partners in to prepare. Everybody should know what's in a plan, and make sure that the partners are involved all the way through and their roles are clear. Use research to guide evidence-based management. In that book of hope I showed earlier, so may every single success story recounted in that is built on research on what the threats are, on the biology of the species or the community, so that what the actions that are taken are appropriate to that species. If you don't do the research, you can get wastage and disenchantment. So ensure the actions are evidence-based, and many of the partnerships were including researchers. They established the nature of the threats, gave advice on how to deal with threats, helped with the monitoring, design the monitoring. You can have a lot of people enjoy the monitoring side of it, but sadly a lot of it can be useless unless it's set up from the start to understand what it is that's being monitored, what the information that's required, how much information is required. And then revise. The researchers also help with revising plans based on responses to management. This is all about evidence-based management. Partnerships are so important for securing funding and support. Without the funding, without the community support, there's often very little action that takes place. Unfortunately, there are often short-term funding cycles. Recovery can take decades. It's often taken decades to result in a species being threatened. It can take decades to bring it back again. With short-term funding cycles, there's a danger of discontinuity, and the partnerships can help avoid that. So you manage the funding cycles to know what's going to happen if the funding cuts out. Always planning ahead to get more funding to keep things going. Employment is one of the things. Keeping that coordinator going from year to year can be critical. And some partners, that's their role, is looking after the funding. And ensure the funders then appreciate the value of their investment. Many threatened species communities are on private land or living in places where you need a lot of community involvement, and often with volunteers. They require their own special motivation. The landholders they need to be part of a partnership. Local communities, local schools are often partners, and through local schools you get to the parents and you get to the landholders and the people living round about. Partnerships with organizations who are trusted by the local community can lead to a success. And the last of those 14 points is advocacy. Partners, again, you can have partners who are, their sole role is advocacy for the threatened species, with governments, with councils, and governments at all levels, local communities, and with politicians, of course. There's a lot of potential voters there monitoring malleefowl across the country. So there are 5 points that summarize the project. The partnerships are not only important for realizing positive recovery actions, but they create additional benefits for the environment, partners, and society. I mean, it's not just about threat removal. It's partnerships bring people together in ways that provide a lot of social satisfaction for the partners, and that can then lead to greater investment in the threatened species conservation. That's our report there on the right. You can read that. That's online. That provides much more detail about what we've done. Partnerships are really important with complex recovery objectives. Many threatened species suffer from multiple threats that interact in ways that are difficult to manage, and so having a variety of viewpoints, a variety of lenses through which people view those threats in the management can be really valuable for dealing with those wicked problems. So Partnerships also help with working between jurisdictions. National recovery plans are rarely achieved without partnerships between governments, but also among NGOs working across multiple tenure types, multiple jurisdictions. I mean, even within a state or a territory, if you've got multiple tenure types, having partnerships is the way to achieve success. Partnerships are not without costs. They take time to establish. Communication can be difficult. It requires organization. Relationships always need some sort of investment, but our interviewees all stated that the costs of having a partnership were far outweighed by the benefits, both direct and indirect, that they gained and the species gained, the threatened community gained from the collaboration. And partnership, cohesiveness, stability, motivation most often emerges when there are clear goals and transparent governance. That's of those 14 points we had before. It talks a lot about the planning side. Be clear what is needed is wanted from a partnership, what can be achieved by a partnership, and that's once you've got that, you can build on it. And that's a few details. So thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation. So I can't see any urgent questions in the chat. So what we'll do is I'll pass along to Rachel for her presentation. Take it away, Rachel.
Thanks, Meg, and it's lovely to be here with you all presenting research, not just listening to other presenters. It's also a little bit nerve-wracking, given that I've often watched these. But it's good to see you all just as the hub is starting to wind up, and I look forward to our chat. I am just going to make sure that you can see the appropriate screen there, Meg.
Yes.
Okay. So this presentation today is the second of two parts on our project 7.1 on valuing research. The first presentation, I think a few of you saw, was really focused on the main part of the project, which was dedicated to looking at valuing as a method, so evaluation methods, metrics, and so on for measuring research value. But out of that project, we also had these insights into research partnerships, and we wanted to take this opportunity to share those. I want to begin by also acknowledging Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, where I have the privilege to live and work, as do many of you, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging in this country. I also just want to acknowledge some of my co-authors who are here today, including Ruth, who drove a lot of this work, did a lot of the interviews and garnered a lot of the insights that I'm sharing today. Tyrone Lavery, who was the postdoc on the first half of this project, and Tim and Holly and many in the knowledge brokering team, Brad Mogridge as well, our Indigenous Liaison Officer, were key contributors to this work as well, and so most of those people I've named are here today, and will hopefully pitch in with extra information and insights as we get to discussion. So as I said, the context for this presentation today is within this broader project, our 7.1 project, which was about methods for assessing the value of environmental research. So that overall project was one in which we used a lot of survey instruments and expert elicitation, and eventually case studies and interviews to develop and test a range of indicators and measures for assessing the value of environmental research. And so the overall report is a bit of a monster and really focuses on going through with a fine-tooth comb all of the indicators and metrics we developed for measuring value. But of course, to understand measuring value, you also have to understand what is considered valuable in environmental research and how to get there. So the timeline of that research project gives some insights into where we've drawn our findings for this particular element of the study. So it started as out of the motivation that came up through the Science Partnerships team and the collaboration of all the hubs in NESP 1, considering more effective ways to measure environmental research. In February 2018, we had an early career researcher conference, and one of the workshops at that conference was about workshopping these questions. After Tyrone was appointed on this particular project, we did a survey of many people in research, government, non-government organisations, and bridges between research and partners in the conservation space to develop and refine a set of indicators for measuring research value. We followed that up with an expert workshop looking at the feasibility and implementation of measuring those indicators. And then our second team in our phase 2 study, headed by Ruth, looked at workshopped question development and then developed case studies using Threatened Species Recovery Hub projects, surveys and interviews with project team members, and by team members I also mean research users and partners to the projects, and we refined a set of measures from there. So the insights into research partnerships are really drawn from a whole series of elements in those phases, from the early career researcher workshop, the survey on indicators, the expert workshop, and sorry, that bottom circle landed in the wrong place somehow, the case study surveys and interviews that we did in the final stage. And the respondents varied. Obviously, case studies are in-depth things, so we had fewer respondents in our case studies, 18 surveys and 10 interviews across 9 project teams, but they allowed a really deep dive into the data. The phase 1 respondents, we had 65 respondents, and you can see from the breakdown there, although about 2/5 of those come from the research sector, there are many from other sectors as well who were represented in that survey. And we gained insights into research projects, research partnerships through that process by first starting with the question that that had come out of the literature and out of also practice in this space that showed the importance of collaborative processes for achieving research value. So the importance of partnerships for delivering research that can be used in practice. And I think a lot of us have experience with this and know this very well from our own work, but it's also something that's been explored in the research literature as well. So from that fundamental insight or set of insights about the kinds of contributing factors in terms of process and inputs and other things that can contribute to achieving research value, we developed a holistic framework and logic model for understanding what research value could look like. And that holistic framework, as I showed at the start, and I'll just go back to that earlier slide, really looked across the logic chain of inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, and impacts to broaden the spectrum of what we meant by research value in the conservation context. And that will become clearer as we dive deeper into some of the measures and findings from that project. So then, having developed that kind of holistic framework and logic model, we then tested it through those steps that I walked through expert surveys, expert workshop, and through research case studies drawn from the Threatened Species Recovery Hub projects. So the fundamental insight from this project that we that we sort of rested the entire project on, and that was also confirmed through the project, is that each step of the research cycle can create value in its own right. So the value of conservation research lies in the measurable impacts and observable changes to management or policy that a lot of us think of when we think of research benefits or research impacts. But it also lies in what emerges as a result of how the research was undertaken. So the fact that stakeholder values and priorities informed how the project ran is a value and an outcome in itself, whether or not the project was actually able to get to results that were implemented. The collaborative and inclusive way that research questions are developed, likewise, it leads to better networks and outcomes that you can then ground future work on, whether or not the research was able to, deliver impact for bilbies or for other conservation outcomes. Building trust, instilling skills, developing tangible, usable products for diverse audiences. All of these things were seen as value in themselves, both in our project conception, but also in the ways in which people responded to our surveys and case studies along the way. So then the research valuation framework that we've developed can be used to guide research partnerships and to understand and give insights into what makes research partnerships effective. So and I'm going to look at that in two ways. One is that looking at the indicators that were highly rated, that were rated as important or fit for purpose, across the indicators and measures that we used in various phases of the study. And these point to multiple dimensions of effective research partnerships. And then we have insights that we gained from the qualitative responses through the expert workshop and through the interviews and even a few comments on our case study survey instrument, which provide more depth on some core questions, which I'll go into. So part one is looking at broad insights from the surveys that we did on the measures and indicators of what makes for effective research partnerships. So looking, for example, at the inputs and processes measures and indicators, we can look at what was ranked highly by survey respondents as being important or fit for purpose measures for their research projects, and therefore potentially by extension to other research projects. So some of the highest ranked measures in terms of fitness for purpose were things like that stakeholder needs were elicited along the way, that stakeholder values and priorities informed how the project ran, that trust was built or maintained, and that data sets were made available to the project. And I'll just say the first three of these in particular are really not surprising, but it's good to have them confirmed in the course of our project, but also to understand that that these things are contributors to research value in their own right. And so to look in a little bit more depth, we have, I've just put there all of those, the way that we framed those measures in the case studies. And on the right hand side there is the rating of fitness for purpose that our survey respondents gave for each of those measures on a scale of 1 to 3. So what I've pulled out here are those ones that were rated 2.5 or above on that fitness for purpose scale. And this really accords with what the original survey respondents rated as the most important indicators of research value as well. So we can see here, for example, that multiple indicators of research partnerships being established and the importance of a reciprocal understanding between stakeholders and research users then really coalesces with those simpler measures on stakeholder needs and values being reflected in the research. And likewise, trust built being maintained was also rated very highly in the original survey as well. So what this really tells us is that there is quite a coalescing of views across the different phases of our study on the importance of these measures. The one that jumped out in the second phase that hadn't been so strongly rated in the first was that existing data sets were used to support the research and were made available for use in the research. And that was also considered an incredibly positive reflection on the case study projects that were being tested. Then we also have research partnerships measures related to outputs and outcomes. So, for example, that outputs were tailored for specific research users and made accessible to everybody, and also that adaptive management was improved. So So there are many, many more measures that were ranked highly, but I've drawn out here the ones that are kind of most relevant to research partnerships. And so to take the adaptive management one, for example, it's not necessarily the case that adaptive management is built through research partnerships between, for example, universities or other research institutions and on-ground managers, but it is one example of how adaptive management can be implemented. And I think that really it connects with what Stephen was saying before about the importance of research informed conservation practice, that this also came out as a highly ranked measure of research value in our study as well. And again, looking at the actual measures there and how they were ranked by our respondents, we can see that they also strongly connect to very highly rated indicators. It's also worth pointing out that in the indicators phase of the study, we looked at specific what we actually meant by tailored research products, and the kinds of tailored research products that were rated as the most important were things like tools that could be used for example, for on-ground action, summaries for policymakers, tailored reports for specific audiences. So not necessarily generic summaries of research, but ones that are tailored for use by specific audiences. And also of reasonably high importance with things like guidelines, guides, checklists, and standards. We can also see that research being made freely and openly accessible was also rated reasonably highly as well in the first phase of the study, as was the establishment of adaptive management trials and closely coupled science practice feedback loops. So there were also some somewhat less but still reasonably important measures. So for example, measures like whether stakeholders actively participated in the actual implementation of the project, measures like whether there were changes to the systems in place afterwards for managing biodiversity, for managing important places and other things. Whether there were improved capacities for equitable and informed decision making and deliberation on conservation. So these came out as reasonably highly rated measures in both phases of the study. And again, I think you can see where for example, one of the insights is around stakeholders actively participating in the project is that it was highly rated by some projects, but not by others. And so what we ended up concluding from that was that it is having stakeholders actively participate in the implementation of the project is really one really useful pathway for achieving research value and effective research partnerships, but it is not the only way. That regular communication, for example, between research users and the active research team is another way of achieving research value and may be more appropriate in other circumstances. And then there was a series of measures that non-academics rated highly and more so than academics. And I think this is actually really important to understand as well, and something that maybe more work could be done to sort of grow appreciation for these particular measures and approaches. So one is that publications were produced in a collaborative manner, and another was that links between the research team and the stakeholders improved through the course of the project. So they were valued by academic respondents, but they were more highly rated and very highly rated by non-academic respondents, and something considered to be of particularly strong value in effective partnerships. And then there were another series of measures that non-academics also rated highly related to the use of different knowledge systems and whether they informed the methods and the outputs of the project, and also the growth of intercultural capacities of the research team. I'm going to talk a little bit about this more in future, but it is important to say these particular measures seem to be confounded by language. It wasn't always clear that people knew what we meant by different knowledge systems or intercultural capacities, and so perhaps that is we're not entirely sure that this is something that the non-academic respondents consistently rated higher, because there was a lot of variability within responses as well. But it is something to consider, and I'll come back to that later. Then there were in the indicator space, we didn't test these necessarily in practice, but there were also a number of indicators on that rated very highly on the importance of co-design and collaboration, contribution to public and community processes, for example, through public advisory committees, through making data sets public and other things. One of the sets of indicators that came out as relatively important in the first phase of the study that we didn't necessarily test strongly in practice was clear communication around barriers and problems that arise and around the failures and limitations and challenges in research. There was also a strong emphasis in the first phase of the study on the importance of agreements, particularly around data and prior informed consent. Now, in the second phase of the study, we weren't able to bring in case studies with strong Indigenous partnerships, for example, where some of these issues may have come up more strongly. So these particular issues were not tested strongly in the case study phase of the project, but they were considered to be important elements of achieving effective research partnerships in the first phase of the study. So now I'm just going to go through a few of the in-depth insights from the interviews in the expert workshop that we held that can also flesh out some of these questions in a bit more detail. The first question is, why are relationships important? And we gained a number of insights into why that might be the case. One of the key insights was that collaboration in a time-constrained world was strongly connected to relationships. So interactions were reported as happening more quickly and easily where there was already trust and relationships in place. It's easier to pick up the phone. It's easier to get in contact with the people that you need to get in contact with when you already know them. And so things can flow much more smoothly. Going into a bit more depth on the importance of strong relationships and the benefits that they deliver. So trusted relationships were seen to facilitate a lot of elements of effective research collaborations in the collaboration themselves. They facilitate data sharing and more productive use of existing data, where researchers, for example, are able to process data that might be held in a repository somewhere that might not otherwise have been analysed. But also it's that two-way communication between researchers and data custodians on the appropriate application of data and how to understand the data and interpret it in the most effective ways. Good relationships were also seen to be a key enabler, of course, for effective problem solving where problems arise in research partnerships. And a number of people reported that relationships give you the ability to have open conversations about when something isn't working and what can be done about it. And so, as one government partner noted, for example, we're able to express concerns early and express them bluntly when they arise. And ideally, good, strong relationships help you have that kind of open conversation in both directions. But there also were concerns raised by researchers, for example, around the ability to have those frank conversations about particularly communicating research findings that might be seen as particularly challenging or uncomfortable. So I'll come back to that again in a moment. Another of the benefits of robust relationships, which extend well beyond the project itself, is that researchers then become a trusted source of advice for whether it be people in government or people doing on-ground conservation management. And strong relationships are seen to endure and maintain value even where often people move on from specific roles. And indeed, some of the respondents reported the research project itself becoming the vehicle, the opportunity for academics and non-academics to develop a shared purpose and a reason to interact, so that the relationship is in fact seen as the ultimate benefit that arises from a particular collaboration. There are a few contributors, of course, that come out on effective relationships. I suppose these are intuitive, but it's worth spelling them out. There was an emphasis put on the individual's willingness and capacity to demonstrate respect for others, particularly by listening and keeping an open mind. There was emphasis on putting in deliberate effort to foster relationships and make sure that they happen, and the hard yards was one of the phrases used around that. There was emphasis on good communication, whether it be, through those informal updates. So one research collaboration reported, it's those informal updates that provide that opportunity to flesh out the detail of what's going on in the research and to really get to the bottom of problems. Or, in other collaborations, it might be regular, for example, annual results summaries. But whatever the process is, that effective communication is a contributor to forging those effective relationships. A couple of key challenges were noted. One is staff turnover and the difficulty that happens when you forge relationships and people move on. So the flip side of that is that some of those relationships, of course, endure beyond the specific positions, but it is a challenge for particular research collaborations when staff turnover at either end of the process. There's also the need to manage carefully communicating bad news stories, as I mentioned before, findings research users don't want to hear or that researchers feel that research users might not want to hear, and that those challenges are definitely felt in certain contexts. The other lesson out of the relationship space is that trust is complex. It's a lot more complex than you might think. So in an intuitive sense, lack of trust was equated in several instances to poor research uptake, and I think that dovetails with a lot of what we already know. But also trust can be developed at different levels and can mean different things. It can be trust in the quality of work done by technical experts. It can be trust that researchers are acting in good faith, for example, using data appropriately and usefully. It can be trust in a particular method, as well as trust that develops between individuals. And trust may vary within an organisation, and this was something that raised where you might have, for example, trust between people who are working together all the time in an operational sense, but that there might be more wariness at higher levels of research user organisations where risks are being weighed up differently and where that close relationship with the researchers may not be held. And one of the other issues that was raised at the expert workshop that has also been raised in the literature is what happens when, for example, policymakers trust too much. And so there's been some research on this by Lacey et al, which we cite in the report. And I'll just quote her quote to sort of flesh this out a bit. So while trust can reduce information and processing costs between parties, trust can also lead to blind faith or a lack of vigilance between parties, potentially causing cognitive lock-in, favouritism, uncritical commitment to a suboptimal course of action, or limitation of the integration of diverse ideas. So it's just a caution on the notion of trust, that where that trust is so great that that people are never going to rock the boat, that maybe that then limits the conception of what might be done in policy or in practice. Lesson 3 from the in-depth studies is that co-design is more complicated than you might think. So we often use co-design, and it's frequently used in the research planning space, particularly where collaborative research is the norm, like in programs like NESP. Co-design is frequently then used as a catch-all to signify the good thing that should be done around research. But actually, co-design's meaning it can often have very specific meanings, and its application and importance vary widely between different contexts and different types of projects. So different co-design approaches may be relevant to different projects and also different stages of projects, but also the feasibility of co-design depends on the nature of the project and the partnerships at hand. Sometimes research users may not always have a good range of tools available to co-design research. So building capacity for co-design and tools for co-design that are fit for purpose may be key in many cases. In specific cases, co-design must be resourced, so particularly for Indigenous communities, but other under-resourced communities to actually participate effectively in co-design practices. And a key challenge in any co-design is giving appropriate consideration and weight to non-academic knowledge and values in the process of co-design processes. So a lot of hidden and informal power dynamics are at play in the privileging, for example, of academic knowledge, but also of policy knowledge or government-based knowledge that may then override or subtly sideline other forms of knowledges. And so active consideration and active weight given to those issues is key in making co-design more effective. And co-design may not always be applicable. So research users do not always want to or have time to participate in full co-design processes. And research users may not always have the research questions clearly articulated, and sometimes they actually appreciate having researchers help contribute and shape up those questions. So a broader conversation may be more appropriate than just assuming co-design in all cases. For example, around what the management needs are, what the cultural imperatives are, or other needs that are driving the research and the associated knowledge gaps with those. and then coming up with appropriate ways that might fill these gaps. And that's something that Ruth has talked about in another publication that we cite in our report. So a better question, and this was raised at the expert workshop in particular, may be whether design processes are not necessarily co-designed, but whether those design processes are fit for purpose for the particular circumstances. And the final lesson I just wanted to draw out was that we may stand to grow appreciation for diverse knowledge systems and intercultural capacities. So we don't know, as I said earlier, whether academic researchers really do consistently rate these measures as slightly less important than non-academic respondents to the case study work. Because it was conflated by a whole bunch of things like language and the language of diverse knowledge systems and the diversity within the responses. But it may be the case that these are less valued by academic researchers and more valued by non-academic researchers. And so, you know, some of the reasons for this may be that research institutions are still more likely to foreground Western science approaches, in which, after all, are their bread and butter. It may be that researchers are less likely to recognise non-Indigenous expertise, for example, practitioner knowledge or landholder knowledge, as coming under the banner of diverse knowledge systems. So research projects that may be taking account of other forms of experiential knowledge may not use that language, and maybe that needs to be unpacked more in future studies. But it's also possibly the case that there may be less institutional encouragement or support within research, within university research contexts than there might be with a lot of practitioner and policy contexts. So growing awareness, skills and capabilities in this area may be worthwhile and may require further investment and support within institutions. And I think it's important to emphasise that we're not necessarily talking about just support for engagement with Indigenous communities and for Indigenous knowledge systems, but really growing awareness and skills and capabilities in understanding the diversity of knowledges that are out there and how they might be adopted and used to support and inform findings on any kind of research collaboration. It's also possibly the case that those in policy and practitioner agencies may have a more direct relationship with diverse locally based perspectives, knowledge systems and people, and may be more likely to recognise practitioner knowledge or other forms of on-ground knowledge as contributing to research. And so this potentially shows us that recognising and integrating diverse knowledge systems may be an important benefit of these research collaborations, of having research projects work closely with on-ground partners. And this may be one of the many important values that non-academic practitioners sometimes bring to research partnerships.